Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is the podcast about this thing called graphic design criticism. This is an episode that I've been looking forward to since I started the podcast almost 3 years ago now. Rick Poynor is on the show. I do not think Rick needs an introduction. He is a prolific writer, critic, and editor on graphic design, photography, typography, and visual culture in general. His career began at Blueprint magazine, where he then went on to co-found and serve as the first editor of I magazine. He also co-founded Design Observer with Michael Beirut, Jessica Helfand, and Bill Drentel, and has written for print and continues to write a column for I today. When I think of design criticism, I think of Rick Poynor, and since he doesn't come from a design background, I was really curious where his interest began and how he got into all of this. So this conversation begins in the early 90s with the story of how I came together, but quickly moves into how design criticism has evolved and how it's changed and how he thinks about it today. We talk about the great conversation that he had with Michael Rock in 1995, where they try to define and articulate what design criticism is and can be. And we talk about what he's interested in now that he's not writing about design as much. And we also talk about the writers and publications that are really exciting him today. This conversation was such a joy for me. I was honored to have Rick on the show and really enjoyed what he had to say and his optimism and excitement towards the next generation of design writers. I left this conversation sharing his optimism, and I hope that you do too. If you are a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for just $5 a month or $50 a year. Members get an exclusive monthly newsletter that features behind-the-scenes content, links, and articles from former guests about design and writing and criticism and all the stuff that we talk about on the show. Scratching the Surface is fully supported through these memberships, so if you like the show and want to help with its ongoing production, I hope that you consider joining. Thank you, as always, for listening, and here it is. This is me talking with the great Rick Poynor. I've been reading a bunch of your work to prepare for this, and I was trying to think about how I wanted to frame this conversation and things we could talk about that might be a little bit different. And I kind of want to start by going back in time to 1990, almost 20 years ago, kind of around the time that you were starting I magazine, because I think there's something interesting in that era, the kind of late 80s, early 90s, where you were writing about all sorts of design and your interests were varied. And then right around the time that you were starting you really zeroed in on graphic design. And I have two questions around that. I'm curious what it was about graphic design that kind of pulled all your focus. Was that an intentional focus? And did you see the type of design writing that was coming? Because over the next couple years after that, there really was a flourishing of design writing. Were you kind of aware of that? What was your thinking in that era as you were really starting to focus on graphic design as a subject to write about?
It was actually quite a slow build-up to that 1990 moment where we launched and I became very committed to graphic design. I always have to be careful here because to explain the origins of this could be almost too detailed.
Okay, go for it.
Basically, I was a very visual teenager. I nearly did fine art as a degree subject, and I certainly did art all the way through high school. But I was torn between that and English and studying English. And so that was my commitment to writing on the one hand, first as a reader, but I also wanted to write in the longer term, and then to the visual arts. As a teenager back in the 70s, I'd never heard of graphic design. I didn't know much about it. There was a printing press in the art room, and I never even took very much interest in that because I was so fine art focused. So it was only later that I discovered design, but still, I discovered design quite a while before it even occurred to me to write about it. This was the era in the early 80s when the style magazines such as The Face here in London were being published. I was a music fan, like so many people in design are, and so I loved album cover graphics. And on the one hand, then I had a grounding in the history of art, and I had by studying visual history of art at university, I had a training in visual analysis. And then at the same time, I was becoming more and more aware of design in popular culture or as popular culture through the magazines and album covers I talked about. So for a long time before I started writing about graphic design, let alone focusing on it, I was actually a highly informed observer and consumer of it. And in
Right.
fact, in 1983, well, I guess I was in my mid-20s. As a birthday present, I got a copy of Meg's History of Graphic Design,
Mm.
which had just been published. So,
Yeah.
I think that probably is quite unusual for a non-designer, an ordinary person, as it were, to get interested in the subject and acquire a book like that, which, as we know, it became quite foundational in the course of the
Yeah.
80s into the 90s for the historical study of graphic design. And there it was. I had that as my reading. I started to buy other graphic design books at that stage. I bought one about total design,
Oh, yeah.
founded by Wim Crowell and others in Amsterdam. That's again around 83, 84. And on trips to Amsterdam, which I started to visit around then, I became just more aware of posters, interesting books in bookshops. So this was bubbling under for an awfully long time. I
Mm-hmm.
became a journalist in 84. I worked on a couple of computer magazines. And then in 86, with all this preparation I'm talking about, the point came where I felt I could present myself to a design magazine as a possible writer.
Mm-hmm.
Although in a way I had no track record and there was no reason why they would take me on, I just knew that I could do this. I got a job on a thing called Designer's Journal in 1986. And then 2 years later, I was approached by the editor of Blueprint magazine in London, Dan
Mm-hmm.
Sujic, who is now director of the Design Museum. And he said to me, would you like to come for lunch? And at that lunch, he asked me if I'd like a job as deputy editor on Blueprint. And this was just fantastic. So
Yeah.
almost without
Yeah.
trying too hard, I landed on the key design publication in London at that time. A very exciting place to be. Writing about the writing on the magazine was about architecture, interior design, furniture, industrial design, and a little bit of graphic design. So, as
Mm-hmm.
you rightly said just now, at the start, I was writing across all those subjects and frantically kind of learning my stuff and trying to catch up.
Yeah.
And every so often, because I had this prior interest in graphic design, something would come up, like Neville Brody would have an exhibition at
Mm.
the V&A, and I was the natural person then to write something about that. So I began to do that while still writing about the other subjects. I should stress really, because it's something I think people probably don't always realize. They just think I'm a graphic design nut or something, that my interests were always broad. They've remained broad throughout my entire working career. I
Yeah.
spend as much time looking at uh, art and photography as I do at graphic design. I may not write about art, but it's there in the background. That's my idea of fun. Go out to an art gallery and look at an exhibition. So I know
Right.
about what's happening, and I think it informs my design understanding. So back in going back to Blueprint, there was this chance to do more and more writing about graphic design, which I seized. As a journalist, I should stress, I didn't see myself as a critic. I was doing journalism. I was going out, I was meeting people,
Mm.
interviewing, reporting on what was happening, the trends and the developments and the key people of the moment,
Mm-hmm.
exactly what journalism concerns itself with. And then after we'd done that, I'd been there for a year or two, the possibility of Word Search, the publisher, launching a new design magazine, a second design magazine, came up. They were feeling bullish and confident because Blueprint had been such a success. And at that point, in tandem with Simon Esterson, who now is co-owner of but back then
Right.
was found a kind of founding designer of Blueprint, together over coffee one day, we discovered we had the same fantasy, which was to launch a new graphic design magazine. I couldn't say now who said it first, but we both had the same thought. We began immediately to work on the proposal. This was then pitched to the directors of Word Search, who went for it incredibly, and there were some twists and turns, but it meant by early 90 they were committed to launching they installed me as editor, and they gave me an extremely free hand. So at that point, to bring this closer up to date, at that point I had every reason to focus much more consistently on graphic design as subject matter. I wanted to produce a magazine. It was a quarterly, as you know. It was review-like in its feeling. So it needed to be seriously well thought out, professional, and convincing for progressive design readership. It also needed to have international appeal. So, again, I'd been working on graphic design, reading books, learning about it, meeting people. But at that point, I really needed to put all my eggs in that basket, really focus on the subject. And that's what I did, basically, for those 7 years that I was editing I pretty relentlessly and exclusively did focus on graphic design.
Yeah, I mean, I have like 5 questions based on on that story that you just
I'll
told.
try and be briefer, but
no, I love it.
It all happened. It happened, as you heard. It actually happened over a period of about 12 years. But,
and I want to go back to the fact that you got a copy of Meg's design history book, and did you say that was a gift that was given to you? Did you see that? I'm kind of curious again why this even was in your life.
Sorry, I asked for it as a birthday present.
Okay.
As I recall it now, I didn't go to a shop and buy it, so it was given to me as a gift. But at my request, I said I'd like to have it. I guess I heard about it because at that stage in the early 80s, and I haven't said this, I was also looking at reading design magazines. So I knew about Design, which was the Design Council magazine. Creative Review had launched in 1980, so I knew about that. So I just had sources of information on the subject, and I was pursuing that, as I was saying, just because I loved visual things, and I discovered design as a source of visual interest. And design was even at that point in the early 80s, with the arrival of people like Brodie, Peter Saville in Britain, Malcolm Garrett, the people who'd come from music graphics, there was a feeling that this was an exciting and fast developing area. And once I'd latched on to graphic design and followed it through the 80s, writing about it on Blueprint, going abroad, meeting designers, I was absolutely convinced by the end of the 80s that graphic design was indeed an exciting area in which things were developing very fast, seemed likely to continue to develop because of the new technology and the changes happening there, and where I felt that there was a need for a standard of discussion, let's put it like that, as well ultimately as criticism, but a standard of commentary and discussion which was a bit higher than what we had already in Britain. And as I've said many times, what inspired me to think we could aim a bit higher and achieve a bit more was looking across the Atlantic to American publications. I was reading Print magazine from the late 80s. I was an Emigre fan and regular buyer and loved what they were doing. This is even before 1990. Around that time, I guess, end of the 80s, I would have seen the AIGA journal, which Steve Heller used to edit. So these American examples were very inspiring to me. And I felt that's the level we want to reach. That's the discussion we want to be part of ourselves.
And I want to come back to something you said earlier about how when you were writing for Blueprint, you saw yourself as a journalist and not necessarily as a critic yet. And I've heard you talk about before that you saw and I think really all of your work not just the work that you did at you referred to as critical journalism. And I'm wondering if you could talk more about that, and even about the differences that you saw then kind of early in your career about being a journalist versus being a critic, and how you maybe kind of move between both of those.
Well, the journalist, the primary task of the journalist is reporting. It's your job to go out there and find the news, and you do
Mm-hmm.
that primarily by meeting people, talking to people, interviewing people. It's a very mobile job. In fact, it's a great job to have. Being a design journalist really was an enormous pleasure, because mainly when I was on Blueprint, I wouldn't be at my desk. I'd be out there somewhere, looking at something new, meeting someone new, hearing about some new
Right.
ideas. And the more you do that as a journalist, the more effective you'll be in your role. It is your role to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was doing a lot of writing for Blueprint, and absolutely trying to develop as a writer. Uh, that's partly to do with knowledge, but it's also to do with writing ability, writing style,
Right.
producing
Yeah.
sparkling copy, uh,
Mm-hmm.
as any journalist aims to do. But it's still quite a big thing. It's quite presumptuous in a way to feel that you know so much about a subject that you are now in a position to offer critical interpretation of that subject. So I was happy for it was I guess it was 6 years, but between becoming a journalist and then starting to serve that kind of it was an apprenticeship, really,
Yeah.
even though I was thrown in right from the start and allowed to write for Blueprint pretty much anything I wanted. I was all too aware of the standard of the writing by reading other writers on the publication, and just also, although we haven't talked about it, reading writers in other areas. So I was a music
Yeah.
press reader, a film criticism reader. There were lots of external benchmarks that you could bring into design writing. It would, as I said, it would be very presumptuous right from the start to say, "Ah, yes, I'm now a design critic," before you've really written anything, before you
Right.
actually know very much at all. But by 1990, I certainly felt sufficiently sure of the subject and my grasp of it to set myself up as an editor. Although
Right.
I always viewed it as a learning experience. I was learning by editing. If I wanted to find out about something, I could actually ask another writer to go out there and research it. And then, in the course of putting their feature together for Blueprint, Blueprint first, but then
Right.
doing the visual research, sometimes making additional contacts, doing some reading, I would be learning about the subject too. So um, my confidence, but also my desire to write critically, increased rapidly in that period from 1990 onwards. And to come back to your point about critical journalism, which was something that I discussed in that dialogue with Michael Rock,
Mm-hmm.
which we
Yeah.
published in in 95. What is this thing called graphic design criticism? Well, there I broached this idea of critical journalism, and it was really just an attempt to give a name or a label to what I felt was valuable about a certain kind of higher level journalism. And at that time, I pointed to the Sunday papers in
Mm-hmm.
Britain, things like The Observer, which would have a reviews section which had very smart critical writing about books, exhibitions, films, and so on. But even if that was sometimes written by people who come from universities, who were academics, who were real specialists in their subject, it was always written in a way that made it very engaging, accessible, and interesting to the educated general reader. So you might not have studied history, but you could read a long review of a book about history, and key points would be made by the writer about the book itself, but often a more general essayistic commentary. And you would really learn something. And you would also get signposts from that kind of writing as to where you could go next. If you wanted to educate yourself in that field, history or psychology or what, literature, whatever the subject of the review happened to be, there'd often be pointers to other places you could go. So that always struck me as a reader myself as a fantastic
Right.
service for other readers, for me as a reader, but if you were an editor, a service that you were providing for readers generally. You were helping the process of self-education. You can find out, and I certainly could in the past, I think it's still the case, you can find out an enormous amount about the world from smart, as I called it, critical journalism. And the final thing to add about that is to differentiate it from straight journalism is, classically, if you're writing a news story or something that's more report based, while you may do that in a smart and skeptical and inquiring way, it's not your job to offer personal opinions and interpretations. That's not what you're doing in that kind of writing. However, there was this sort of hybrid kind of writing, which was part way or somewhere between journalism and straight on criticism. And you'd find this writing, as I said, in the Sunday papers, where it was possible for the writer to introduce ideas of their own, to express a personal point of view, a world view even, to add another dimension to the writing, and to respond to the subject matter, the journalistic subject matter, in a critical way. So it seemed to me, again, that was a really great way of involving readers in the critical process. And that if we could do that within design writing, we might be able to move the writing on to this other level that I'm talking about, a higher, slightly more critical level.
I like that you brought up the Michael Rock conversation, because I read that conversation many times. I've assigned that to students when I'm teaching design writing and criticism, and I reread it to prepare for this conversation. And then I reread the 2011 kind of follow-up conversation that you did for Michael's book, Multiple Signatures. And two things struck me about both of those conversations when I reread them this week. One is I was kind of interested in how a lot of the questions that you were asking in 95, you were asking again in 2011. And then I think they're similar to the questions that I'm asking on this podcast in 2017, 18, 19. And then the other thing that interested me is how at the end of the 95 conversation, there was a certain optimism about where this was all going that was not there in 2011. There was a little bit more cynicism, a little bit more of what happened? Why didn't this go the way we thought it was going to go? Where are you now on those subjects now in 2019? Between that kind of optimism and cynicism, or how have your thoughts kind of evolved since then?
That is a good question, and I accept your description, the distinction you're drawing between those two conversations, because the 95 one happened in the very throes of this explosion of energy in design itself, but also in writing about design. That suddenly there seemed to be quite a lot of writers around, many of whom were coming from America, and those were people who were used in I, like Michael Rock, for instance, who had this ambition to make design writing better. And the publications existed, the forums existed in which we could do that. And it was possible to feel, even at times, one could engage in a kind of dialogue. In the case of I Magazine, a transatlantic dialogue with people, colleagues of Rudy Vanderland's on Emigre and Rudy himself. So this was very stimulating and exciting, and I think a lot of people got caught up in it. When I say a lot, I mean maybe relative to now, but not in larger terms. I'm not trying to suggest this was some huge global phenomenon, but certainly it built up a kind of a pressure. A feeling that there was something at stake, something worth talking about, arguing about even. By 2011, it's not, and we're not just talking here about design, a lot had happened in the world. I mean, politically, economically, new challenges, at times feeling we were on the edge of catastrophe.
Right.
So that was in the background and maybe determined some of the mood of that second conversation. But also, we had to acknowledge that after 2000, the dialogue that had definitely been happening in the 90s didn't continue in quite the same way or at quite the same pace, with one very important proviso. If what I say here is true of print publications, the temperature cooled a bit after 2000. Of course, what we had instead was the blogosphere,
Right.
and the rise of the design blog in the early years of the new century, starting notably with Speak Up.
Yeah.
No longer exists, of course, but
Right.
a real inspiration for the launch a year later in 2003 for Design Observer. Some of my colleagues would query that, but that's certainly the way I saw it and I remembered it. And
Yeah.
I think that was there, this feeling in our little group, the four of us, Bill, Michael, Jessica, and myself, that the new kids on the block had created this extraordinarily vibrant site where a huge amount of discussion was going on, and there was a slight feeling that this older generation we belonged to, which was still very much wedded to print culture and the idea of publishing in magazines, that we hadn't as yet, until Design Observer, seized the opportunity to create something similar. And luckily we did that early enough in 2003 to really kind of make an impression, a quick impression, to catch on, to find readers, and to build up a sense of energy. And so for a while that was happening too. But to come back to the conversation with Rock, in 2011, there was a feeling, perhaps even in the blogosphere, things had slowed down. We talk endlessly. In fact, we talked about it at Tate Modern in the panel discussion about why that happened. Social media must be part of it. I mean, I can't empirically demonstrate that, but it feels like social media provided other outlets for some of the people who before then had been excited to comment at the end of blog posts and help to generate that discussion. Right. With the arrival of Facebook, Twitter especially, people had other outlets, and of course, that just continued. We're going back a decade, but it just kept going and going. And so there was a feeling that the excitement and the energy and the newness was somewhere else. And that was a shame, because people were still publishing good things on blogs like Design Observer, things that once would have generated discussion, but now suddenly they weren't doing it so much. So again, coming back to that 2011 moment, it's like we were getting a slowdown on both fronts, print and online digital culture. The heat wasn't there in the way that it had been. And by that time, of course, a new generation of younger designers had emerged from the design schools, and they were out there working, and they perhaps didn't have the same expectations or interest in forging this kind of vibrant culture of writing, which is really what I've been interested in and have wanted to do all along. And that to come right up to the present hasn't changed. I would still like to see it. I think if you want me to pursue it or ask about it, I can point to places where I think it's happening to some extent. I don't see myself as being, on the front line of that writing anymore, simply by virtue of having been doing this for so long. We've just talked about what is actually a 33-year period. I can't claim to be the same young writer that I was when I started. And I think that at a certain point, the work has to be done by a new generation or new generations, and that there are signs now, it's taken a while, but that process is underway. So I feel encouraged and optimistic, but I don't feel that this is my cause or my fight in the way that I certainly felt 15 or 20 years ago.
Can you talk more about that? That this is kind of exactly, you obviously have interviewed a lot of people. You knew exactly where I was taking taking this conversation, because I was curious about kind of what you see as the quote unquote design discourse today, and you're saying that you're optimistic and that this is a new group of people. Where do you see that happening? What is exciting about it now to you that maybe you didn't see in the 2011 conversation? What's changed since then to now?
Well, I think that actually there are just more things happening since 2011, and
Yeah.
I can't say if I was failing to see something that was happening. I would often ask people, have you seen any interesting websites? Have you seen any interesting publications? And above all, I would ask over and over again, are you aware of any interesting writers? Because we've had, and I've said this before, but we've often talked about this subject in the abstract. Oh, we're for design criticism. But design criticism can only exist if individuals want to write it. So the sign of design criticism's health is always the ability to name writers, to point to interesting things they've written. That's the evidence that it's happening. So to come back to today, there are interesting journals. They tend to be infrequent, but they do exist, and often there will be a single person or a small team who are highly motivated to contribute to the discussion. So I'm thinking of something like Counter Signals, published
Oh
by
yeah.
Jack Henry Fisher in Chicago. I've seen 2 issues of that so far. I guess a third, if it hasn't appeared, is probably in preparation. Another example would be Francisco Laranjo's
Yeah.
Modes of Criticism. He's
Yeah.
published 3 issues of that so far, and it's just him. He wants to do it himself. He doesn't have a staff
Yeah.
or a team. He's the publisher, and he gets it together. He asks people to write things, or he republishes material, I guess, on occasions as well. You can find the kind of writing in there that we might have seen in the past in
Yeah.
Emigre,
Yeah.
especially. There's a great little political journal, looks at political graphics and culture, called Signal, which has published 6 issues and seems to come out about once a year. Again, it's infrequent. That's published by Alec Dunn and Josh McPhee. It's another American one. What else do I like? I think it may have come to a temporary halt, but you can never tell because time passes and then another issue of one of these things will appear. There's one called Back Cover, published
Oh,
in
I don't know
France
this.
by Edition B42, who also publish books, and they've done a fantastic job. They've done about 6 or 7 issues um, of that publication. Often you'll find writing, say, by Robin Kinross, the British writer who they
Yeah.
admire, some of whose work they've translated and published over there. They're obviously interested in Kinross's work with Hyphen Press in London. So that's a smaller independent publisher, but an important one. Someone like Richard Hollis,
Yeah.
very eminent designer and design historian, who also has been featured in Back Cover. I mean, I won't go into too much detail about what they cover. Then the other thing I want to mention, because I'm intrigued by it, is a place where something is absolutely happening, and it's certainly something that I watch and read these days, and that's the AIGA's Eye on Design
Yeah.
website. And
Yeah.
when that first appeared, it wasn't particularly my taste in its visual appearance. I didn't really get the candy colours, and it all seemed a bit too kind of light and pop. I've completely come around on that. I actually think it's very vivid. It feels very contemporary, but even more to the point, it's published a mass
Yeah.
of what is in effect design journalism. And I've been moaning about the lack of outlets for design journalism, the fact that magazines were closing. Well, here is a website published slightly improbably, I feel, by the AIGA, although the AIGA has a great publishing history and it published the journal. At first, I didn't understand why it was publishing something which was so newsy. It just didn't seem like that was its job. But however that came about, under the direction of Perrin Drum, it's turned out to work extremely well. And I think it sets a kind of standard and pace for other publications, whether web-based or in print for that matter, which want to track what's happening now. And if you look at what some of their writers like Madeline Morley or Emily Gosling have been written, go to their part of the site where it lists all their pieces. They've written dozens and even hundreds of texts. And this is great because when you do that, and I know this myself from my experience as a journalist, when you do that, you gain enormous experience. You cover a large field and you really find out what's going on. And the very thing that I was talking about earlier happens. You build your own confidence as an observer and potentially a critic. So if critics are going to emerge, they're going to emerge from something like Ion Design, which gives younger writers the opportunity to do a lot of writing and to make a lot of personal connections and discoveries. That's what it needs. You can't really be a critic unless you're tremendously talented. So it could happen by writing occasionally. If all you manage is 3 pieces a year, you're probably never going to get there,
Right.
because it's just not enough writing practice. However, having said that, of course, there's always the chance of the utterly brilliant writer who writes 3 stupendously insightful long-form pieces a year. I'm not saying it couldn't happen. I just think it's a bit unlikely, whereas journalism provides, and that's what we're talking about with Ion Design, provides very fertile soil for those kind of writers to take root and grow. So that, I think, is interesting. Let's just say a few words about their journal, because of course they then decided that they would become a print publication too. And there have been 4 issues that I've seen to date, and they tend to have themes. So the latest one is called Worth, and it's about money. And this is really interesting what's happening there, because of course, if you were an old school modernist designer, it would probably give you the heebie-jeebies because it's free form, very experimental kind of design, very lively, varied pages, strange typefaces, strange compositions, sometimes quite jarring use of color, intriguing, funky little eccentric illustrations dotted all over the place. A sense when you leaf through it of strangeness, which you don't, of course, get when you look at their website, where everything is very regular and conforms to the format. So they use the opportunity in print to kind of let their hair down and get a bit experimental. As I say, I got hold of these things. I've been reading them. Of course, always ultimately the acid test, I would say, and certainly for me, is the quality of the writing. So that's in the end, that's what I'm looking for. Are we seeing writing that goes significantly beyond what has been achieved to date? And I'm going to leave that as a question. I'm not going to answer that one, but let's leave that as a question for any readers of Ion Design out there. But what I would say is, it's only been 3 years or something they've been doing all this, that they're moving fast and they're developing quickly, and they have an enormous sense of panache and confidence. And all of this is essential to making an impact with a publication. So I 100% salute that. And unlike those other publications I was talking about, of course, it's regular. The website publishes every week, and the journal is coming out regularly too. And that is what we need. Much as I admire these journals that publish occasionally, you can easily lose sight of them when you've got to wait 15 months for the next one to appear. To build up a sense of purpose and to move with a sense of energy, you need to publish regularly, and that's becoming harder to do. Another reason why I'm 100% behind Eye on Design, because they're keeping the flag flying for design writing, journalism, and potentially criticism too.
I want to kind of connect that though to kind of something that you were talking about earlier about reading criticism and journalism from a bunch of different fields. And I think that's something that your writing has always done. You've always kind of connected a bunch of things together. You've always brought in references outside of design. And I would love to hear more about your kind of critical process, I guess, when you are writing about something. How do you go about doing that? How do you think about uh, what is my angle on this? Or do you have certain themes that you're kind of always applying to different things? What's that look like for you?
Over time, it's certainly the case that themes did emerge,
Yeah.
and once there comes a point where why you're doing something. You know what you've said about it in the past, so you don't want to just keep repeating yourself. You need to add something if you're going to stick with that theme. Um, and I guess because these themes emerge, I suppose they emerge fairly spontaneously. You just find them in your writing. At that point where you spot that you have this recurrent concern or interest, even if you hadn't thought about it very consciously, you start to analyze yourself through your own writing. And I've said before, because it's always the case, that the writing itself is a process of self-discovery. I don't want to sound self-absorbed about it, but you can't write for a long time on a given subject matter, which requires you to think about the subject matter, think about what other people have said about it, what you're going to say anyway. And you can't do this without learning something about yourself in the process. So I never felt in a way that, actually, oddly, in a way that perhaps academics, people pursuing a purely academic career might feel this need to formulate almost in terms of a statement, perhaps to get a grant or something, what I thought I was doing. I didn't need to do that. That moment when I had the conversation with Rock in '95 was really, for a journalist, unusually self-conscious.
Yeah.
We were saying, well, we've got this magazine, we're publishing things. Why are we publishing what we're publishing, and what are we trying to accomplish? And there were colleagues coming out of journalism at the time who thought this was all a bit self-involved, self-conscious, or putting yourself in the picture in a way that the journalist is not required to do. And I guess I did that then, and I've stuck with it since, because I had to acknowledge over time I was doing this for personal reasons, and that they weren't mysterious to me, so why not talk about it? And oddly, someone asked me this question very recently, and I just summarized it, that what I thought I was doing all along was a kind of personal search, because it was entirely self-driven, for meaning and value. And of course, since our area is design, it was meaning and value in relation to design and design phenomena. But since I connect those to everyday life, politics, what's happening out in the world, what's happening in adjacent fields, it was a kind of inquiry that had at least half an eye on these other areas of life too, and the ways in which they manifested themselves or revealed themselves through what we were doing within design.
I promise the rest of my questions won't just be things that you said in that conversation with Michael Rock. But the tension that I always think about when we talk about design criticism, and I definitely feel it as somebody who's involved in that world, and you talk about it in that conversation, and I've seen you write about it in a lot of different places, and I think it touches on that kind of self-involvement that you said people kind of felt when that was coming out, is this sense between design as some sort of kind of critical object versus design as a commercial thing. And in that conversation, I think you call it like the hairdresser logo problem, that not all design is almost worthy of criticism or needs to be dissected in that way. And I would love for you to talk more about that, especially in regards to that kind of critical position that you were just talking about, and this self-involvement, kind of all of these subjects. How should we think about how we talk about design? What are the things that deserve these larger discussions?
I will answer it, but I also want to start, I think, by
Okay.
bringing this back to the pragmatic issue of where you can publish.
Mm,
Is there somewhere to publish? Because you can only develop as a critical writer if someone is willing to give you a forum in which to do that critical
right.
writing. Now, you could just have a blog and you could sit there on your own, and some people have made an impact through that kind of self-publishing. That's absolutely fine, but there's no way probably that kind of blog is ever going to feel central to the discourse of the field. For
Mm,
that, I think we need visible publications, whether they're printed, online, or both. So the task, the problem you have as a writer is to find publications, digital or print, which will publish your stuff. And
mhm,
you're really going to have established quite a presence and a strong sense of trust on the part of the publication and its editors to be given a regular place in which you can pretty much, as a critic, say what you like. So that's it. That's really what one is trying to achieve. And the fact that I was able to do it, for instance, by writing a column for print magazine for 17 years, um, it didn't come out about overnight. I'd been writing probably for, lose track of the time, was it 15 years or something before that happened, before
right.
that opportunity occurred. um, maybe you could just get a column just out of the blue just like that, but if I was the editor of that publication, I'd want to be very convinced a writer could deliver what I needed before I handed them that kind of freedom.
Mhm,
So this, coming back to everything we've been saying about journalism, publishing journalistic pieces, there is a jump if you're a regular contributor, say, to Ion Design, since we agree, that's a place where it's writing is happening now. There is a jump from doing that, from going to meet the latest funky designer and writing a nice little 500-word report on that. There's a big jump from that to becoming an essayist, where you discourse on whatever it may be over
mhm,
3 or 4 thousand words, and actually find someone, an editor, a publication, which is willing to publish that. And you asked me this question about what's happening now, and how optimistic do I feel. I still feel, it even applies to me, despite having been in the field a long time, that there is a lack of places where such writing is asked for. And it's why it tends to surface in these small publications like Modes of Criticism, where Loranjo
mhm,
wants a long essay piece, and there are writers who want to supply it, and they're prepared, to settle for a publication that doesn't have very wide distribution for the sake of saying exactly what they want. And they're absolutely right if they're thinking, well, the people I want to reach, the people who really care about this criticism, will notice my essay. They do. They do.
right.
It's not going to have a kind of wider or deeper traction than that, but it's certainly going to reach the kind of people who would want to read it.
You've also taught criticism and you teach, kind of writing and criticism classes. How do you talk about this with your students, knowing that maybe the places where they can write are getting fewer and fewer? Um, do you kind of talk about it with them? How do you kind of talk about what design criticism should be today?
Actually, one thing I've said from time to time is that that's fine. You go on one of these courses and you want to be a writer, but what we're crying out for is editors and publishers who can supply the platforms where other people can write. So I think editing is a really important contribution, and without editing and the platforms that editors provide, there can be no criticism of the kind that we're talking about. It just isn't going to happen.
Mhm.
come back to writing. Yeah, it's true. I taught writing at the Royal College of Art for 5 years, and I think it was 7 years teaching at SVA on
Oh,
the
right.
course when Alice Twemlow was the director, and then now at University of Reading, I'm not so much teaching people how to be writers or critical writers, but I am teaching as part of a module which we call design thinking, but that's ideas in design rather than that kind of business school design.
Okay.
But there is a section in that last 5 weeks on criticism where, much as you were saying earlier, we look at key texts from the recent history of critical writing as a way of highlighting certain themes of criticism. So, yeah, I'm quite focused on it still. Still talking about it, trying now to find ways to make it interesting to a much younger cohort of students. So these are undergraduates. These are
Okay.
people, 20 years old. These are not postgraduates in the way that the Royal College of Art or the School of Visual Arts people were. And I think occasionally we get someone who probably does fancy becoming a writer eventually. They can see that's an interesting thing to do alongside designing. But they're there to learn how to be designers primarily. Whereas, to go back to those writing courses, the aim was to produce writers. At SVA, and this was what was so brilliant about the SVA courses as I knew it then, especially when it was a 2-year course, the people who came on that course absolutely wanted to write in the field of design, and so the course could be very focused. At the Royal College of Art, it was called Critical Writing in Art and Design, and it attracted people from both sides, but in practice, far more people came in from the art world. They might even have studied fine art or history of art. There were some people who came in from fashion, architecture as well, and design, especially graphic design, was real minority. So any teaching on that course had to be aimed more generally at the needs of the critical writer, and it had to accept that if people went on to do critical writing, it was probably going to be about art on that course. So that determined. On the one hand, I found that quite liberating because there was no need to talk about design very much at all, and given my interest, that didn't bother me in the slightest. But I was slightly regretful that more people weren't emerging from the course who wanted to be design writers. So having said that, a few did, and there's a publication called Dirty Furniture.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a journal of design. It has a little bit of graphic design material, but it's more about three-dimensional design products, objects, and so on. And that was started by people who were on the course. Great. That's exactly what I'm talking about. They emerged from the course and they created a platform in which writing could happen. Exactly what we needed.
Talking about these platforms, and as a way to start to kind of wrap up the conversation a little bit, I would love to hear more about your media consumption habits, I guess. You gave a great list of kind of current design publications that you're reading. You are well versed in design history. It seems like you are consuming a lot. How do you do that?
Well, of course, it's actually a key issue and a key question now, because when social media started to happen, especially having come from the world of print, having had half a lifetime of reading and writing with print in mind, of course, I was hyper aware of how much time that had taken.
Right.
How many hundreds and thousands of hours had gone into that. And here was a new distraction. You could get with the modern world and spend half your time, as of course did happen, devoting yourself to tweeting away merrily or whatever. And I just felt this, for me, this would be a mistake. It's not like I would enjoy it that much necessarily, or get very much out of it in terms of my activities as a writer. But what I would do is seriously distract myself from the work I wanted to do.
Right.
So, and also, I've had a computer and worked on a computer since 1984. So there's nothing Luddite about this at all.
Right.
But I just thought I've got to keep things in proportion, and I'm not going to lose sight of my personal priorities and my values. And it may be, that in restraining myself, I overdid it. But the fact is, I'm still hugely excited by the world of print. I'm drowning in books and publications here, and there it is. And to come back to your point about what am I reading outside of design, I subscribe to only a very limited number of publications. I get the London Review of Books, which is enough reading in itself, actually, exactly equivalent to the New York Review of Books. I get Sight and Sound magazine, the film magazine, which I've been a subscriber to since I was 19 or 20. I absolutely love it, and we haven't talked about film, but film is my hobby and pastime, and has been all these decades. And it's probably the thing I'd want to write about if I wasn't writing about design.
Oh, interesting.
What else? There have been periods where I would just receive for free magazines like Freeze, the art magazine.
Oh, yeah.
I don't get or even follow that very much anymore, because I guess I'm more interested in photography than art these days. So I do read the British Journal of Photography, and I don't have a subscription. You've reminded me I must get one to Aperture magazine, which I really love.
Yeah.
So I'm kind of hyper selective. And this is very different from the past, because when I was young, so this is going back to the 80s through the 90s, I was a magazine junkie. I spent a fortune on magazines. I've got a storage unit with shelves full of magazines. I reached the point where I just had to stop that. It didn't make sense on any level to keep consuming magazines like that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I didn't hear the same message when it comes to books. So that's principally where my money goes these days if I'm buying print. But I won't give it up. There's no reason to give it up. I'm perplexed that a generation has emerged that seems genuinely unexcited by and unmotivated by the printed object. If I ask the undergraduate students at Reading if any of them look at magazines, maybe one or two in a class
I
might
know.
confess to actually having bought a magazine. It's it has to be said. It looks like it's over. It's over. I don't know what the new alternatives to printed magazines will be, because I don't get the sense that those reluctant magazine readers are trying to find the equivalent of magazines online. They want everything in ever smaller, ever more kind of bite-sized and consumable units of information, in which the kind of discourse we're talking about simply isn't possible.
Yeah.
So longer term, big question mark, I think.
My last question is, I actually kind of want to go all the way back to the beginning of the conversation when we were talking about you kind of zeroing in on graphic design, and you made the point that I agree with, that though maybe professionally you've focused on graphic design, you've always had these wide interests, and you're writing a lot about photography now. You just mentioned film. I'm curious what else you're interested in now, or what are the things that you are thinking about and excited about right now?
Gosh, that's a very big and general question. What? I mean, I think it's probably not appropriate to go off in a big way on this tangent, but I have been fascinated by the development of this kind of global box set culture, where it's really a streaming culture now. People aren't buying the box sets so much, but what is in effect at its best long form filmmaking, and in which the kind of pleasure, the satisfaction that you get from the best seasons is very similar to reading a really dense well-plotted novel with many characters exploring complex motivations, and a sense sometimes of fantastic sense of place or milieu.
Yeah.
The chance to go into the details of whatever it may be, to go into this with a kind of attention to detail that simply isn't possible in a faster moving film, much as I love film. So, in terms of what of significance has happened in our culture since 2000, I think a lot of the action is there. I'm sorry to say it, but they're on our television screen. So I probably spend way too much time looking at those things these days, late at night. But when the working day is
I was going to say, you're making me feel a lot better about myself and the amount of time I spend doing that also.
Yeah, but it's, okay. I know people. I have friends who are kind of holding back, or they feel a bit like I was saying about social media. They're aware they could consume an awful lot of time. All I can say is, given the an obsession which I had already with film and film history and film culture, this seems like the latest stage in its development, and it would be kind of crazy not to be looking at it, enjoying it, thinking about it.
Yeah. I agree with you. I think about that a lot. Even just things of even these kind of definitions or delineations between what is a movie and what is a television show, all of these things are starting to fall away. And I find that very interesting that we're all consuming them in the same place. And we are getting this like really long form storytelling that is like a novel. I think it's so interesting.
Yeah, so exciting. And also, the other thing is this clearly is a key element of the new global culture, in that we can rely on the fact that everyone everywhere who has a TV set is watching this stuff. So there can be a discussion, a dialogue, and you only got to go online when one of these seasons is playing to see this detailed analysis, episode by episode, by a whole bunch of critics. We should be so lucky in graphic design to have these kind of outlets to go into this level of detail, critical detail.
I think that is a great way to wrap this up, and it has some of that kind of optimism that I sensed in the 1995 conversation I talked about before. Rick, as you know, your writing has had a profound influence on me and my influence on design criticism, and probably why I do this podcast to an extent. And so it is a complete honor to have you on the show. Thank you so much for this great conversation.
It's very kind of you. It's been very enjoyable. Thank you.
This episode was recorded on June 21st, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.